This afternoon, I'll be discussing some of the Ottoman silk textiles on display in the Syrian room and in the Damascus room here. These are familiar to those of you who've already had a chance to see the house, and if you haven't, let me encourage everyone to have a look afterward too. The rooms are going to be open, as Carol said. While we are here now, let me give you a little bit of an idea of where they are exactly. So we have two vitrines in the Damascus room. Each has a silk velvet cushion cover. They provide a backdrop, in fact, for the photos and documents on display. Also in the Damascus room, another piece of the same type of silk velvet in a slightly different format. It's part of a large vitrine that includes Bohemian crystal, along with Ottoman and other Islamic ceramics, metal, and glass. And these objects begin to give us, together, an idea of the type of art and luxury good that might be found in an 18th or 19th century house in Damascus. So the textile is in fact probably a bit older. It's probably 17th century. In one of the two Syrian rooms downstairs, another cushion cover is found. It's a bit larger than the pair upstairs. It has a similar format, and please note especially the distinctive end finishes here at the top and at the bottom. In the opposite vitrine is another piece of the same type of velvet, again in a slightly different format. Now these silk velvets, and especially the cushion covers, are going to be the main topic for my talk tonight. After a brief introduction to the type in general, I'll discuss how the textiles are used to furnish the homes of wealthy and sometimes less wealthy Ottoman subjects in the 17th and 18th century. Now in doing this, we're going to be treading on some pretty familiar art historical ground. We'll be discussing the spread and change of style, while also heading into new territory to talk about the silk industry and economy of the Ottoman Empire. At least I sort of assume it's new territory for most of you. Now, to cover this ground, we'll focus on the Ottoman Empire between about 1600 and 1750, a time during which its territories grew to their largest geographic extent, that's 1683, and then shrank somewhat after wars with the Russians and Habsburgs. As in any empire, there was significant push-pull between local and central concerns. Equally, as you can imagine, different political, religious, social, and material cultures in different regions introduced significant variation within a broader category of Ottoman art and architecture. As you might guess, Damascus rooms are found in Damascus, but Ottoman homes in Istanbul, Edirne, Belgrade looked a bit different. However, as you might also guess, textile culture was surprisingly consistent, and especially for luxury textiles, which were often traded over great distances. The standardization comes in the fact that textiles, objects made out of textiles, were the main furnishing in any early modern Ottoman home. The making of Ottoman silk fabrics is most strongly linked to the city of Bursa in Western Asia Minor. It was a silk trading center even in the Byzantine period. It remained a silk trading center after the Ottoman conquest in 1326. The trade in silk was silk from northwest Persia, in fact. It was the most expensive, the most sought after. It arrived once a year in a caravan, and merchants from all over the Mediterranean and as far away as England awaited these caravans. Bursa was also a silk weaving center. In the 15th century already, both local and Latin artisans were making silk fabric there. By the later 17th and 18th centuries, its role as an entrepot, I think, was largely subsumed by its role as a center for production. But as interesting as that may be, it's not directly germane to today, and we won't be taking it up. The city of Bursa was famous for several specific types of silk fabric. One of the most popular was a figured velvet with gold and silver brocade. In Ottoman Turkish, this is called çatma, and this is exactly what the Shangri textiles are. And this çatma is a term I'm going to be using today. And I'm using it because it's much shorter than the equivalent English term. For those of you textile people out there, it's voided and brocaded silk velvet. It's a little too cumbersome. Çatma, as we see here, was woven in lengths. It was suitable for different uses. At the whim of the purchaser, take it home, do what you like. Çatma was also made in several very specific formats. The one here that we see, the one here at Shangri, is probably a half. For the whole, two pieces in mirror symmetry were sewn together. The border provides a neat frame that unites the halves. Now, inventory lists from the 17th and 18th century, mostly the 17th, specify an object called a makad. And this is a sitting textile. And the inventory lists also tell us it was most often made of chatma. The makad was used along the long, low platform found in Ottoman residences, or again, at least the residences of the wealthy. And there it is. The platform is called a sedir. It was used for sitting during the day and sleeping at night. Again, in the early modern period, this is one of the very few items of furnishing in a room. The corner where the makad was placed was the place of honor. And we have record of one English diplomat who visited. He described it as the best seat in the house, and he even knew the Ottoman official term for this, which is sedir basha, head of the sedir. Chatma was also made into quilt faces, which required 4 pieces to make the whole. And again, it's the use of a border element that makes the quarters seem like a complete piece, also establishing size and use. Now, the assumption that, such an expensive and frankly kind of stiff and scratchy material was used for quilts seems a little odd at first. But again, our Ottoman inventory lists insist that this is the case. And I should say, too, that this was really only a facing. It's not a proper cover. It would have been sewn on to something thicker and softer. And the facing, it also had a purpose. When this textile was folded up to be stowed during the day, it was placed in an open cupboard or niche. This way the facing could be seen. It added another elegant object to the array of goods found in the home. Even more visible than the chatma makads or quilts were cushion covers. The Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, who visited Bursa in 1641, commented specifically on the vast production of crimson sofa cushions worked in gold, like this one, and also like the one represented in the painting from almost a century later. Now, we're going to come back to our Casanova and his ladies, and also to the room in which they entertain themselves. Note for now, though, the most prominent cushion covers. They occupy, again, a place of high visibility. Now, as the 17th century wore on, the cushion covers, in fact, proved more popular than the sitting cloths or the quilts, as suggested by both paintings and by inventory lists. Again, a subject to which I'll return. And in fact, at this point, I'd like to narrow my focus to the cushion covers. Now, there are hundreds of this type in museum and in private collections all over the world. I estimate that 400 or 500 of them survive. We know this is a very small fraction of the initial production. We have records of merchants trading in dozens or bags full at a time. The cushion covers have 3 defining characteristics. The size, which is about 60 centimeters across, loom width, by about 100, give or take. Their material is always chatma. This is very standard. The format always includes the set of end finishes at both ends. These are called lapits in the English language literature and niche in the Turkish. The main field of these varies, though. Some have these all-over patterns, carnations, sunbursts. Some use medallions or other centrally planned floral arrangements. They participate in a wider Eastern Mediterranean aesthetic, though they probably cannot be mistaken for Italian or French textiles of the same period. The palette is overwhelmingly crimson with a little variation. Out of the several hundred I've looked at, I think about 2 are green. You can barely pick it up here. And there is a small but very important subset of cushions on a pale ground, another subject to which we'll return. Now, a quick word about the cushion covers. Despite their ubiquity, and despite the fact that they really make a nice, tidy category for study, nobody's done it. And this is probably because, well, to be honest with you, none of these are super gorgeous. They also cannot be linked to any kind of imperial production, and that is the dominant paradigm for Islamic art history. The lack of scholarship, and also, frankly, the fact that they just don't look so good, begins to explain some of the photos I'll be showing you this afternoon. Many of these shots are taken in museum storerooms in bad lighting by me, and also by Professor Atasoy in Istanbul, who very generously allowed me access to her photo archive. Let me return now to the textiles and give you a brief look in depth. Again, let me emphasize the structure's uniform. Like all velvets, chatma is a compound fabric. It means it has more than one set of warps and of wefts. Chatma, in fact, uses 2 sets of warps and 2 sets of wefts. The foundation is satin, in which the very, very thin silk warp threads cover entirely a thick cotton weft. This is the core. The velvet pile is formed by supplementary warps in colored silk. These are looped over tiny wires during weaving and then cut. And together, all of these little cut tufts form the velvet pile. To form the motifs, some areas are left without pile. These areas are covered with brocading wefts. They give the surface its sort of characteristic gold and silver glitter. Sorry. The brocading is done during weaving. I should emphasize this. This is something on the loom. It's not applied afterward. The brocading wefts are discontinuous, though. It means they don't go from edge to edge. The weaver avoids passing them under the velvet pile parts. You can imagine this would be a waste of a very expensive material. Ottoman chatma is always figured, which in textile terms, it means it uses a decoration that is more complex than the stripes or checks. Here we have a really large tulip and some carnations. In the city of Bursa, as well as in other places in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere, all the way from Italy to China, figured compound textiles were woven on large looms equipped with pattern harnesses. For our purposes this afternoon, it's probably most useful to think of the pattern harness as a computer, a very primitive computer made of cords and lashes. The precisely arranged cords and lashes were programmed ahead of time by a special expert. He understood the loom. He knew which warps and wefts had to interact to make the curve of a stem or the swelling of a fruit. The cords and lashes were then attached to the loom before weaving began. Operating the pattern harness required an extra worker, the drawboy. He worked in tandem with the weaver. Perhaps most important, once the pattern harness was attached, it could be used over and over again. Weavers could make multiple cushion covers, quilt covers, macaws. They could make really long lengths. It allowed for great efficiency and for exact repetition. Also, with some small changes, the weavers could make several different formats using the same pattern harness, at least, again, for this type of textile. The threads that went into a chatma were also purchased from other craftspeople. The most expensive material, of course, is the gold or silver wrapped silk used in the brocade. This was purchased from a central state-controlled workshop. The crimson and green silk that made the velvet pile was also costly, and this quality, it really mattered. This is what gives the cushions their characteristic deep color and their gloss. Now, as I said earlier, the cushion covers through the 17th century are immediately identifiable by format. The main field, the lappets at each end, the standard palette, the fairly consistent set of motifs, combined, recombined over and over. The style was closely associated with the structure of the fabric. The structure of the fabric was closely associated with silk and gold are closely associated with expense and with luxury. Here we have the link. Ottoman painters understood this. The artist used a chatma cushion to indicate that the traveler shown here in a tent was in fact a gentleman, a sophisticated urbanite in the countryside. Other details certainly contribute to our understanding. His costume, the horse trappings of his own horse, the richness of the tent itself, his many industrious servants. But the cushion stands out, and in fact, it frames the gentleman. Artists working elsewhere, even in Austria, also included representations of the cushion covers You can look carefully, you'll see their lappets carefully outlined. They helped convey the elegance of this residence. They may have helped convey its Ottomanness as well. Now, I should stop here and clarify one last time the connection between the style and the material. All known Chatma cushion covers are in this format, and conversely, this format is used only for the Chatma type. There are no damasks, no brocaded satins, no taketes that use this format. Except, of course, when the format was shamelessly imitated. The style exclusively associated with Chatma, Lapit's main field motif, was mimicked in other materials. Chatma on the left, a velvet cushion cover embroidered off the loom in gold thread on the right. In another example, we have silk floss on cotton or linen. Again, one on the left, the embroidery on the right. Another set of embroideries, which are attributed actually to Dagestan in the Caucasus Mountains, also follow the format very closely. Wool pile examples are usually dated later than the actual Chatmas, maybe to the second half of the 18th century. This one is really especially close. But we find for this type in general that the palette is more variable and the elegant curvilinear motifs have sort of flattened a bit. And this is something dictated by the carpet loom. Just like the Chatmas, the wool pile examples are called yastık. This is the Ottoman Turkish word for cushion. And into the 20th century, they served as storage bags for grain and other foodstuffs. The bags, though, also function absolutely to display. They were set inside the tents of pastoralists along the perimeter. They show their decorative surfaces. They also indicate the abundance of goods inside. Now, despite the really poor survival of cotton fabrics, we still have the occasional printed example. This is one of the most humble imitations in terms of both material and labor. Printed cottons were certainly made in Istanbul, but also in central Anatolia, in northern Syria, and in Cairo. Dating these is very hard. We have reason to think production was ongoing between the 17th and 19th centuries. Now, the embroideries, the wool pile, the printed examples, all of these are made in different places with different materials, different modes of production. Some were clearly made for market, some were made for home use. The adherence, though, to the proportion of the luxury version, the insistence on the use of lappets, the selective use of motifs indicates that the Chatma model was known and valued, perhaps for its ability to confer distinction on its owner, or at least to indicate the owner's familiarity with a visual culture of an elite. Now, all of this bears a lot more consideration, but I'm not going to talk about this today, none of the individual contexts. I'd like instead to take them as a group, as evidence for the broad recognition of the distinctive style and an enthusiasm for it. The appeal of the format spurred demand, led to the production of the variants, unified by format, lappets and other features. And in silk, cotton, and wool examples, these are relatively more or less accessible to people who could not afford the Chatma type, which was, as it was made of silk and gold, relatively expensive. In Bursa, the weavers of the Chatma cushions, the originals, if you will, also understood the appeal of the format and responded to the enthusiasm and the demand. Sometime in the 17th century, probably around 1650 or later, the weavers themselves developed a new bargain version of the Chatma cushion. I should stress here that this subset is not a final devolution of the type. They were produced, as far as I could tell, in parallel with the more accomplished versions. Nor were they made in some far-flung outpost by ill-trained weavers. They were made on the same large and complex looms, the same sets of steps. They required experts to design the motifs, to build and attach the pattern harness, and of course to weave. They used similar, if not identical, materials. Now, all this said, the final product is absolutely the result of a series of economizations. The first is the size. They are substantially smaller than the other examples. It's pretty clear, a lot less thread of all types was needed. The threads themselves are also much less densely packed. 2 cushion covers in the Damascus room have about 8 velvet warps per centimeter, and this is consistent with other of the subtypes, others in this subtype. These 8 warps per centimeter are much fewer than those of the larger group, which use between 12 and 14. Now, this doesn't actually sound like much, but if multiplied over the entire width of the textile, it's about a 30% reduction in the amount of red silk required. The pile, though, was consequently sparser, and, well, perhaps it didn't look so good. Nonetheless, there it was, the same type of item. Let me go back once, actually. I'd like to point out here, too, and this is a little hard to quantify, that the quality of the silk also looks different. It's sort of extensively twisted and glossy on the one on the left, and, well, a bit less so for the one on the right. The gold brocading weft is also a bit sparser. There's less metal in each strand of this thread, and in the one on the right, it's almost barely twisted. And last, the subgroup uses 2 colors of pile, but not in tandem, instead in separate areas. You see how the green runs really only through the outsides of the one on the right. Now, for these chatmas, the pile is made from the warp threads. The warp threads have to run through the whole textile. They're warps. You can't switch in the middle. It allows for, the loom really allows for no discontinuity. It's probably easiest to see this, in fact, on the back. Using only red in the center and only green in the margins saves, again, half of another really expensive material, the crimson and green dyed silk. But it still gets to count as having 2 colors. One could argue that these economizations were a necessary reaction to temporary shortages or to rising prices of silk or gold. For the weavers, it's of course better to work with inferior materials than not to work at all. This is a matter of livelihood. But closer examination reveals that some of these chatma cushion covers were in fact, from the very planning stages, meant to be bargain versions. The designing of the motifs is the work of an expert, a specialist. The grace of the drawing, the success of the proportions, the combination of motifs relies on his skill, not that of the weavers. In these 2 examples, the medallions are a little bit clumsy. You can see some errors in the scalloping here, and in the one, again, on the other side, we have the scallops turned into only this sort of unsuccessful, funny little fringe. And in all of these cases, the medallions are clumsy, and each one is differently clumsy. This is not one thread model used over and over. We also note the motifs in the lappets, these end finishes, they're kind of stiff, they're not detailed. The same may be said about the drawing in the main border. Another indication of this planned reduction in quality is in fact a reduction in size. This too must be planned during, again, the planning process. It couldn't be altered during weaving. Models for larger textiles cannot just be cut down to make smaller textiles. Rather, smaller ones have to be planned anew. The poorly drawn motifs, made by maybe less skilled and less well-paid artisans, the series of economizations in the silk, the size, indicate perhaps that these textiles were the weaver's response to a demand by people with shallower pockets. Even objects which are less clearly accomplished and less sumptuous had the power to signify. Our Casanova is seated in what's meant to be an upper middle class house in Istanbul. This is not a palace, he's not a prince or a pasha. The story of the Casanova is part of a series of picaresques. These refer to everyday life. The artist, too, has furnished his painting with objects found in Ottoman residences, including the fine, but perhaps not too fine, chatma cushion cover. The relationship between the weaver's production and the consumer's demand for the chatma cushion covers is really important. And I think we can make the case for demand driving production by comparing the fate of cushions to the fate of other luxury textiles. During the latter 17th century and the first half of the 18th century, Estate inventories indicate a significant and steady decline in the numbers of velvet and chatma good other than cushions. Sorry. Like the ones we see here. So after 1650, inventories have very few of these. This is an incredible contrast with estate inventories made between 1580 and 1650, in which chatma macads or quilt faces were among the most expensive items and formed a big proportion of the chatma objects. So presence and then absence. The disappearance indicated in the documents might seem startling at first, but then when thinking about extant objects, it's actually really hard to identify plain velvets or macads or lengths of chatmas from after 1650 or so. The weavers made cushions, maybe they made more cushions. Making more cushions meant making fewer of the other types. They disappear. At the same time, making cushion covers in a range of qualities guaranteed a market at several levels. The chatma, with its universal appeal, guaranteed that the weavers would have a ready market. But then, something else happens. Twist. Sometime in the 18th century, maybe around 1720 or 30, a new type of chatma cushion cover appears on the scene. This is a portrait by Jean-Étienne Liétard. The subject is the Habsburg envoy to the Ottoman Empire, the Graf of Ulfeld. The Graf had arrived in Istanbul in July of 1740. He would stay in the capital only 10 months, until the following May. The portrait was surely made sometime during these months. Hold on a sec, please. In 1740, Liétard himself had already been in Istanbul for about 2 years. He'd become the favorite portraitist of the Western ambassadors and their retinues. He would stay another few years, returning to Vienna, then moving to Paris. He styled himself as a Turkish painter, as you can see from his self-portrait. Liétard was an acute observer of textiles, which were, after all, the main objects in most Ottoman residences, like this one. And in the portrait of Ulfeld, Liétard included a type of chatma cushion which had not been depicted before. The lappets, one of the defining features of the type, are present. Of course, the proportions are relatively familiar. It has a central medallion of sorts. It has flowers, leaves, and palmettes. But overall, this is a sea change. This comes first from the white ground of the textile, probably meant to be read as silver brocade. The difference also comes from the delicacy of the motifs, from the intertwining tendrils and blossoms. The aesthetic is vastly different. Liétard's charcoal drawing of an anonymous young woman shows similar cushions, which can be identified precisely with known examples, two extant, one at the Victoria and Albert and another in a private collection. And there it is. This is part of a subcategory that includes several variations, all on pale ground, all using red and green pile to make curvilinear motifs, mostly delicate but three-dimensional blossoms, leaves, tendrils. I should emphasize that the structure of the fabric is exactly the same as that used in the crimson ground versions. All the same materials, too, silk and cotton for the foundation, silk velvet pile, and metal and silk for the brocade. The new style, if we can call it that, finds parallels in some of the other media from the 18th century. Attenuated tulips, fully blossoming roses, seen here, provide comparanda. Nor was this style confined to the arts of the book and the palace. Fountains built in Istanbul around this time are adorned with new variations of blossoms, many rendered with more naturalistic drawing that suggests the volume of the flower or the fruit. The cushion covers, like those of our Casanova and the Graf Ulfeld, show that the popularity of the chatma cushion covers survived the turbulent early 18th century. Istanbul was the center of rebellions in 1703 and 1730. The cushions still served to line the back of the sedir. They were still woven in Bursa and nearby. They were still exported to other parts of the empire. We know this from trade records made in Aleppo and Damascus. Liétard and his Habsburg subject also allow us to confirm the real power with which the cushions signaled the status of their owner. Ulfeld was proud of his role as imperial representative to the Sultan. Around the same time he was nominated for the position in mid-1739, and quite possibly in honor of the nomination, he commissioned this engraving from a man named Heumann in Nuremberg. The quality of the photo in this case is totally down to me, and I apologize. We don't know if the engraving was itself based on a painting. No predecessor painting has been found. The engraving does definitely predate Liotard's somewhat similar portrait. For the painting made in Istanbul, the cushions are a salient authenticating detail, and an especially telling one. Ulfeld was perhaps, well maybe not perhaps, he was a very proud man, and he was certainly one who felt very much the weight of his responsibilities. His clothes, he's wearing a white and coral silk ensemble with slashed sleeves to show the lining. His document, the document has the imperial signature of Sultan Mahmud I. It may be a reference to the Treaty of Belgrade, which was signed in 1739. Even his very posture indicate how he felt. It is unlikely that he would consent to inhabit a room or even a depiction of a room with less than elegant and costly materials. And certainly the Chatma cushion covers in this group are elegant. In fact, they use as much gold and silver in the metal brocading threads as many of their crimson-ground predecessors. They pack the threads equally tightly. The accomplished draftsmanship of the motifs, the excellent craftsmanship, contradict absolutely any notion of decline in the Chatma making craft in Bursa in the 18th century. More evidence from inventory lists, in this case taken in the context of price history, suggest how the mechanism worked for the weaver and for the consumer. As the 17th century progressed, the cushion covers remained relatively less expensive when compared to other luxury home furnishings. Those would be knotted wool piles of big size, carpets, quilts, embroidered felts. However, the average real price, and real price meaning the price adjusted for inflation and for currency devaluation, the real price for a Chatma cushion was higher in 1740 than it had been a century earlier. But something else sets apart the ownership and the cost of the 18th century Chatma cushion, and bear with me here a little bit longer, this is not entirely simple. A century earlier, in 1640, the richest third of men and women in a sample of about 200 wealthy and elite Ottoman subjects, this richest third owned a greater number of Chatma cushions than the next group down, the middle third. But the cushions of the richest were actually worth a little bit less than each of those owned by the middle third. But by 1740, the situation reverses itself. The people in the richest group own fewer cushion covers, but each is worth more. The growing ownership of the less expensive versions occurs among the middle group. It suggests a steady and possibly increasing production of the maybe not quite first-rate objects. The fewer but more expensive Chatma cushions that were concentrating in the hands of the wealthiest perhaps indicate a new style, more elegant, perhaps more sumptuous. In the new type of Chatma cushion, the dazzling effect of the light, the graceful motifs, the glittering metal brocade, all of these things conspire to obscure a significant material change. The cushion on the left uses crimson ground. This is created by the silk pile of the velvet. The brocaded areas create the motifs. The other cushion uses a ground left bare of pile, which is then covered with brocade. The motifs are formed instead by the green or crimson silk. In this reversal lies an enormous economization in the amount of expensive red or green silk required to weave. The making of a plain velvet, which is to say a velvet with no motifs or brocaded areas, requires a length of warp, meaning the red silk in these cases, that's about 10 times as long as the finished textile. You can imagine all this extra length goes into making those little tufts that form the pile. For this one, you'd use a bit less of that because there are brocaded areas, after all, voided areas where you don't need the tufts. In the one with the brocaded ground, though, you'd need exceptionally less of that very expensive material. After all, there was very little velvet pile, very few tufts, and you could really save by purchasing less silk. This is a major capital outlay by the weavers. I'm sure they were delighted. The new cushions, in fact, look more opulent, a fact confirmed by the proud Graf as he postures in front of them. The novel combinations of format and motif, of course, are not merely a byproduct of economizations. We should think of this as a change in its own right. It is a bonanza for the weavers. They can make it for less and sell it for more. The ascendance of the Chatma cushion cover relies on its power to convey the wealth and sophistication of the person who owns and displays it. Because of its prominent position in the room, it was more successful than the macades or the covers or the other types of textiles. Its relative affordability, or maybe its range of affordabilities, also ensured it could become legitimately popular among a relatively large part of an urban and maybe less urban elite. They could identify it, covet it, and purchase it. The close association between style and object ensured that even the lesser versions might carry some of the same éclat as their higher quality counterparts. The cushions in Lyotard's portrait of the Habsburg Graf are the result of converging circumstances, the emergence of a new aesthetic, and the weaver's realization it could be manipulated to save on expensive materials. And it was gorgeous. They could make the new style for less, they could sell it for at least as much, and it didn't look like a lesser object. And in fact, the brocade ground Chatma cushion cover would entirely take over from about the mid-18th century, though its success was unfortunately not long-lived. Eventually, it fell out, the lappets disappeared, the palette changed, and it became a victim itself of shifts in fashion. And so fashion goes, and I think I will too. I'm going to leave it here, and let me end by thanking you for listening.